Do you believe that children can remember lives they never lived? What if we told you right now that there are real documented cases that prove exactly that? And if you think that past life memories only exist in movies, and that there always has to be a logical explanation for everything, then we're really curious to hear how you're going to explain these 10 mysterious cases. So, let's jump straight into the first case, and this one is truly intense. Number 10, the toddler who knew his doctor's name. This case you're about to hear is one of those stories that sends chills down your spine because of how simply impossible it should be. Imagine you're a mother going about your normal day, and your 2-year-old child suddenly says something that stops you cold. Something they could not possibly know. Something that makes you question everything you thought you understood about memory, consciousness, and what children are actually capable of perceiving. A mother from the Midwest was driving with her toddler in the back seat when the conversation took an unexpected turn. The child, barely old enough to form complete sentences, suddenly mentioned a name. Not a family member's name, not a cartoon character. The name of the obstetrician who had delivered him into this world. The mother nearly drove off the road. She had never once mentioned this doctor's name to her son. The delivery had been routine, and after leaving the hospital, she had no reason to discuss the details of his birth with anyone, let alone a toddler who wouldn't understand. The doctor wasn't their regular pediatrician. There were no photographs of the delivery room, and no documents lying around with the name visible. There was simply no logical pathway through which this child could have acquired this information. When she asked her son how he knew that name, he looked at her with the casual confidence that only small children possess and said he remembered. He remembered the bright lights. He remembered the cold room. He remembered being pulled from somewhere warm into somewhere overwhelming. And he remembered the man in the mask who caught him. The mother sat in stunned silence for several moments before pulling the car over. Her hands were trembling. She called her husband, struggling to explain what had just happened. Together, they began asking their son careful questions, and each answer only deepened the mystery. He described sensations from those first moments of life, the confusion of sounds, the strange feeling of air entering his lungs for the first time, the blurry face looking down at him. Some researchers who have studied this case point to a phenomenon called birth memory. The theory suggests that under certain conditions, the brain may retain impressions from the birth experience, even though conventional neuroscience tells us that the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming explicit memories, isn't developed enough at birth to store such experiences. But others believe this case points to something different entirely. They argue that what the child demonstrated was not memory in the traditional sense, but something closer to consciousness continuity. The idea that awareness itself persists across transitions that we don't fully understand. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how specific the memory was. The child didn't just describe vague sensations. He provided a name, a verifiable, checkable detail that his mother was able to confirm. And that specificity is what separates intriguing anecdotes from genuinely unexplainable cases. Was this child somehow accessing information from beyond the normal boundaries of memory? Or is there something about human consciousness that we fundamentally don't understand? The mother has since connected with researchers who study these phenomena, and her son's case has been added to a growing database of children who seem to remember things they shouldn't be able to remember. And trust me, that was only the beginning. The truly shocking cases are still ahead of us. Subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It's completely free and helps us continue creating these exciting videos. Thank you so much. Number 9. The boy who died in a burning plane. This case is absolutely insane, and you'll barely be able to believe it. But it really happened and has been verified by multiple independent sources. A little boy from Louisiana began having terrifying nightmares about dying in a plane crash. And when his parents finally listened to what he was actually saying, they discovered something that would change their entire understanding of life and death. James Leininger was just 2 years old when the nightmares began. Multiple times per week, he would wake up screaming, thrashing in his bed, shouting phrases that made no sense for a toddler. He screamed about being trapped, about fire, about not being able to get out. His legs would kick as if trying to escape from something, and he would cry out that the little man couldn't get out. His parents, Bruce and Andrea, were understandably concerned. Their son had never been exposed to violent imagery. They didn't watch war movies. They had no books about military combat. There was nothing in this child's environment that should have produced such vivid and specific terror. But the nightmares were only the beginning. During the daytime, James began displaying an unusual obsession with World War II-era aircraft. At an age when most children could barely name basic shapes, James could identify specific fighter planes by their silhouettes. He corrected his parents when they misidentified aircraft in books. He insisted on drawing the same type of plane over and over again, always with the red sun insignia of Japanese military aircraft visible in the sky. When his father pointed to one of his drawings and asked what the rising sun symbols represented, James matter-of-factly replied that those were the Japanese planes that shot him down. Bruce Leininger was a devout Christian who did not believe in reincarnation. The idea contradicted everything he had been taught about the soul and the afterlife. But he also couldn't ignore what his son was telling him with such unwavering certainty. James began providing details that no 2-year-old should know. He said the plane he flew was a Corsair. He said it took off from a boat. When asked what the boat was called, he said Natoma. His father searched and discovered that there was indeed an aircraft carrier in the Pacific Theater called the USS Natoma Bay, and the details kept coming. James said he was shot down at Iwo Jima. He said his friend on the ship was named Jack Larson. He said his plane was hit in the engine and caught fire before crashing into the water. Bruce Leininger spent months researching, driven by a need to either confirm or debunk his son's impossible claims. What he found shook him to his core. A pilot named James Houston Jr. had served aboard the USS Natoma Bay. He had flown a Corsair fighter. On March 3, 1945, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, his plane was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The engine was struck. The plane caught fire. James Houston Jr. crashed into the Pacific Ocean and was killed instantly. He was 21 years old. The Leininger family eventually made contact with surviving veterans who had served alongside James Houston Jr. When little James met these elderly men, now in their 80s, he spoke to them with a familiarity that made them weep. He recalled inside jokes. He remembered the layout of the ship. He identified squadron members from old photographs that his parents had never seen before. One of those veterans was a man named Jack Larson, the exact friend James had named years earlier, before anyone had even begun researching the case. The Leininger case has been examined by researchers from the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. It has been featured in books, documentaries, and academic papers. Skeptics have attempted to explain it through cryptomnesia, the theory that James may have absorbed information subconsciously. But the timeline makes this explanation extremely difficult. And James was displaying this knowledge at an age when his media exposure was essentially non-existent, and several details he provided were obscure enough that even dedicated World War II historians had difficulty locating verification. James Houston's sister, who was in her 80s when she learned about the case, met with the Leininger family. She said that hearing little James talk about her brother felt like speaking to James Houston himself. She had no doubt in her mind about what she was witnessing. Today, James Leininger is an adult. He no longer has the vivid memories he possessed as a child. This fading is common in cases like his, with most children losing their past life memories around age 7. But the evidence remains, the verifications remain, the questions remain. How does a 2-year-old from Louisiana know the name of a World War II aircraft carrier? How does he know the specific circumstances of a pilot's death? How does he recognize elderly strangers as if greeting old friends? Absolutely fascinating. And believe me, the next case is just as mind-blowing. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. If you could remember a past life, would you want to know the details, or would you prefer to leave the mystery unsolved? Just write your answer in the comments below. We're excited to see what everyone thinks. Number 8. The boy who lived in Hollywood. This case is so incredible that it attracted the attention of researchers from one of the most prestigious universities in the world. A boy from Oklahoma began telling his mother about his previous life as a movie star. And when the evidence was finally gathered, it left everyone speechless. Ryan Hammonds was 4 years old when he began having what his mother Cindy described as vivid and disturbing memories. He would wake up grabbing his chest as if experiencing a heart attack. He would beg his mother to take him home to Hollywood. He spoke constantly about a previous life filled with glamour, travel, and ultimately heartbreak. At first, Cindy dismissed it as childhood imagination, but Ryan's insistence grew more urgent, and his details became increasingly specific. He talked about dancing on Broadway. He talked about meeting famous stars. He talked about traveling across the ocean on big boats to places where the people looked different. He described a life of wealth and excitement, but also loneliness and regret. Cindy began researching, hoping to find some logical explanation. She checked out library books about Hollywood's golden age. One night, while flipping through a book about old movies, she turned to a page showing a still photograph from a 1932 film called Night After Night. Ryan immediately pointed to one of the men in the photograph. "That's me," he said. "That's who I was before." The man Ryan identified was not a famous actor. He was an extra, a background performer whose name didn't even appear in the movie's credits. Finding information about him seemed impossible. Cindy eventually contacted Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who specializes in cases of children who claim to remember previous lives. Together, they began an investigation that would take months and require the cooperation of film historians and archive researchers. And the man in the photograph was eventually identified as Marty Martin. He had been an extra in the early talkies, had worked as a dancer, and had later become a talent agent in Hollywood. He had traveled to Paris. He had been married multiple times. He had lived in a large house with a swimming pool. All of these details matched statements Ryan had made before anyone knew who Marty Martin was. But the verifications went even deeper. Ryan had mentioned that his previous self had two sisters. Marty Martin had two sisters. Ryan described a street address where he had lived, providing the specific numbers. Records confirmed Marty Martins had lived at that address. Ryan mentioned that he didn't like his name because it didn't sound like a real name for a tough Hollywood guy. Marty Martin had been born Morris Kolinsky and had changed his name specifically because he felt it wasn't suitable for the entertainment industry. Perhaps most remarkably, Ryan met Marty Martin's daughter, a woman who had been skeptical about the entire investigation. After spending time with Ryan, she said that speaking with him felt like speaking with her father. He knew details about their family that only someone who had lived that life could have known. Ryan's memories have faded as he has grown older, following the same pattern observed in so many of these cases. But his story remains one of the most thoroughly investigated and well-documented cases of apparent past life memory in modern history. How does a child from rural Oklahoma develop such detailed and verifiable knowledge about an obscure Hollywood extra who died decades before that child was born? As some researchers suggest, these cases point to consciousness being non-local, meaning it isn't confined to a single brain or body, but might persist and transfer across what we perceive as separate lives. Others remain skeptical, searching for conventional explanations that grow increasingly difficult to sustain as the evidence accumulates. What we know for certain is that Ryan Hammonds knew things he shouldn't have known, and that fact remains true regardless of which explanation we choose to believe. Ready for something even more intense? Then pay close attention now. Number 7. The most studied case in history. What you're about to hear is perhaps the most thoroughly investigated reincarnation case ever documented. It happened in India in the 1930s, attracted the personal attention of Mahatma Gandhi, and convinced even hardened skeptics that something extraordinary was occurring. The case of Shanti Devi remains the gold standard against which all other past life memory cases are measured. Shanti Devi was born in Delhi in 1926. From the age of 4, she began making statements that bewildered her family. She insisted that her real home was in a city called Mathura, about 90 miles away. She described a husband named Kedar Nath. She talked about giving birth to a son and then dying shortly afterward. She provided detailed descriptions of her previous house, her previous family, and her previous daily routines. Her parents assumed these were childhood fantasies and discouraged her from speaking about them. But Shanti persisted with remarkable consistency. Unlike made-up stories that change and evolve, her accounts remained identical year after year. The details never contradicted each other. Her emotional responses to certain memories seemed genuinely distressing in ways that felt too authentic to be performance. When Shanti was 9 years old, a business associate of her father happened to be from Mathura. When he heard the child's claims, he was intrigued enough to investigate. He confirmed that there was indeed a man named Kedar Nath Chobe living in Mathura, and that his wife Lugdi Devi had died 10 years earlier, shortly after giving birth. Kedar Nath was contacted. He travelled to Delhi to meet Shanti Devi. According to all witnesses present, when she saw him, she ran toward him with tears streaming down her face. She addressed him using intimate pet names that only his deceased wife had ever used. She asked about their son, and she asked about other family members by name. Kedarnath was shaken. He said that everything she said, every detail, every mannerism reminded him exactly of his dead wife. The case generated enormous public interest. Newspapers across India reported on the mystery. Eventually, Mahatma Gandhi himself appointed a commission to investigate. The committee included politicians, lawyers, journalists, and scholars. They were determined to either verify or debunk this remarkable claim once and for all. They took Shanti Devi to Mathura. She had never visited this city in her current life. Yet when they arrived, she directed the carriage through streets she had supposedly never seen, leading them directly to the house where Lugdi Devi had lived. Along the way, she commented on changes that had occurred since her previous death, noting buildings that were new and lamenting shops that had closed. At the house, she recognized family members. She pointed out alterations that had been made to the structure since Lugdi Devi's death. Most remarkably, she led investigators to a spot where she claimed Lugdi Devi had hidden money. The family confirmed that Lugdi Devi had indeed hidden savings in that exact location, a fact known to virtually no one outside the immediate family. The commission published their findings. While they stopped short of declaring reincarnation proven, they acknowledged that they could find no evidence of fraud, no possible normal explanation for how this child had acquired such detailed and accurate information. Shanti Devi's case attracted researchers from around the world. She was interviewed repeatedly throughout her life, and her story never wavered. She was offered money by publishers, filmmakers, and curiosity seekers, but she refused to profit from her experiences. She lived a simple life, working as a teacher, and died in 1987. In her final interview, conducted shortly before her death, Shanti Devi was asked what message she wanted to leave for the world. She said simply that death is not the end, that consciousness continues, and that the lives we live carry consequences into lives we haven't yet begun. The case of Shanti Devi has been analyzed by researchers for nearly a century. No conventional explanation has ever been offered that adequately accounts for the evidence. She remains one of the most compelling witnesses to the possibility that human consciousness is not limited to a single lifetime. Truly fascinating. And this is nothing compared to what's coming next. Number 6. The boy who remembered the island. This case is so extraordinary that it was investigated by a documentary film crew who traveled thousands of miles to verify a child's impossible claims. What they discovered defied every expectation and left the boy's own family struggling to comprehend what was happening. Cameron Macaulay was born in Glasgow, Scotland. From the time he could speak, he talked constantly about his other family. Not an imaginary family, but a real family that he insisted was waiting for him on an island called Barra, located in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, over 200 miles from Glasgow. Cameron's mother, Norma, was raising her son alone. She had never visited Barra. She knew virtually nothing about the island. Yet her son spoke about it with intimate familiarity. He described a white house near the beach. He described watching planes land on the sand. He described his other mother, his other father, and his brothers and sisters. Most disturbingly, he spoke about how his other father had died. He said his father had been struck by a car and had not survived. Cameron described watching from the window as it happened. He spoke about this with a sadness that seemed far too deep for such a young child. Norma initially dismissed Cameron's stories as fantasy. Many children invent imaginary friends and alternative families, but Cameron's insistence never wavered. He begged repeatedly to be taken to Bara. He said he missed his other family. He said they must be wondering what happened to him. As Cameron grew older and his memories showed no signs of fading, Norma began to take his claims more seriously. When a documentary filmmaker became interested in the case, Norma agreed to take Cameron to Bara. She wanted answers, and she thought the journey might help her son find closure, whatever that might mean. When they arrived on Bara, Cameron led them through the island's small roads as if he had lived there his entire life. He pointed to the airstrip where planes land directly on the beach, exactly as he had described. He talked about locations and landmarks that matched his memories. Eventually, they found a white house near the water. Cameron became visibly emotional as they approached. He said this was it. This was his home. The current owners of the house allowed them to enter, and Cameron walked through the rooms with an eerie familiarity. He pointed to where furniture had been. He described changes that had been made. He looked out a window and indicated the spot where he claimed to have watched his father's accident. Investigators later discovered that a family named Robertson had once lived in that white house. The Robertsons had children, and one member of the Robertson family had indeed died in a car accident. Cameron's relief after the visit was palpable. It was as if a tremendous weight had been lifted. He had finally returned to the place his memories had been pulling him toward for years. His mother Norma was left with more questions than answers, but she could no longer dismiss what she had witnessed. And the case of Cameron Macaulay has been studied by researchers interested in cases of children who remember previous lives. It contains multiple verified elements: the description of the White House, the location near the beach, the planes landing on sand, and the family history that matched Cameron's statements. What remains unexplained is how a child from Glasgow could possess such detailed knowledge of a specific house on a remote Scottish island he had never visited. The documentary footage captures his recognition in real time, and the emotional authenticity is difficult to dismiss. Some researchers believe cases like Cameron's suggest that consciousness carries information across what we perceive as separate lifetimes. Others search for more conventional explanations. But no one who witnessed Cameron's journey to Bara has been able to fully explain what they saw. And that was still relatively mild compared to the next case. Trust me. Number 5. The twins who recognized everything. This case involves two children who displayed knowledge of lives lived by sisters they never knew. It remains one of the most controversial and emotionally complex cases in the study of past life memories, because it centers on tragedy, loss, and a father's desperate hope that his daughters had somehow returned to him. In 1957, a terrible car accident claimed the lives of two young sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, ages 11 and 6. They were struck by a driver who had lost control, and both died at the scene. Their parents, John and Florence Pollock, were devastated beyond words. John Pollock held unconventional beliefs about consciousness and reincarnation. Before his wife became pregnant again, he became convinced that his daughters would return to him. Florence dismissed this as grief-talking. But when she became pregnant and doctors detected twins, John interpreted this as confirmation of what he had expected. The twins, Gillian and Jennifer, were born in 1958. As they grew, their father watched them carefully for signs. What he observed troubled their mother, but fascinated him. Jennifer, the younger twin, had a birthmark on her forehead in the exact location where Jacqueline had a scar from a childhood fall. She also had a birthmark on her hip that matched one Jacqueline had possessed. The odds of such specific matching seemed astronomically small, but the birthmarks were only the beginning. When the twins were about 3 years old, they were given a box of toys that had belonged to their deceased sisters. The toys had been stored away since the accident, and the twins had never seen them before. Yet they immediately recognized specific dolls, naming them correctly and referring to them as their own. The family had moved away from the town where the accident occurred, and the twins had no conscious knowledge of that place. Yet when they visited years later, the girls began pointing out locations and buildings they had supposedly never seen. They became frightened when they saw cars approaching, with Jennifer in particular showing extreme distress that seemed disproportionate to normal childhood caution around traffic. Gillian reportedly had memories of being the older sister and being responsible for watching Jennifer. And Jennifer, meanwhile, seemed to possess memories of being dependent on her older sibling. This dynamic matched the relationship between Joanna and Jacqueline. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the pioneering researcher of children's past life memories, investigated the Pollock case extensively. He documented the birthmark correspondences, the recognition of toys, the navigation of previously unknown locations, and the behavioral patterns that seemed to match the deceased sisters. Critics have suggested that John Pollock's intense expectations might have influenced how he interpreted normal childhood behavior. They argue that children are perceptive and might unconsciously fulfill parental expectations. This is a valid concern in any case where a parent is heavily invested in a particular interpretation. However, the specific physical characteristics, the birthmarks that matched scar locations, are harder to explain through psychological mechanisms, and the immediate recognition of toys the children had demonstrably never seen before suggests something more than parental suggestion at work. The Pollock twins eventually lost their memories of being their previous sisters, following the typical pattern of childhood past life memories fading around age 7. As adults, they have given a few interviews, and the emotional complexity of their situation is understandable. Were Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock somehow reborn as their own younger siblings? The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. What is certain is that their case continues to challenge researchers who attempt to explain how children can display such specific knowledge of lives that ended before their birth. All ready for the finale section? Then pay close attention now, because each remaining case is more incredible than the last. Number 4. The baby who was his own grandfather. This case is one of the strangest you've ever heard because it involves a child who claimed to be the reincarnation of a family member who had died before that child was born. And the details he provided included family secrets that had been deliberately hidden for decades. Gus Taylor was born in the American Midwest. At approximately 18 months old, an age when most children have only a few dozen words in their vocabulary, Gus began making statements that alarmed his parents. During a diaper change, he looked up at his father and said plainly that he used to change his father's diapers. His father was confused. What could a toddler possibly mean by such a statement? Gus then clarified. He said he was his grandfather. He said he had come back. Gus's grandfather had died approximately a year before Gus was born. The family had mourned, moved on, and had not discussed the deceased grandfather with Gus, who was far too young to understand such conversations anyway. But Gus had more to say. Over the following months, he provided details that no one had ever told him. Details that no toddler should possess. Details that had been deliberately kept secret from most of the family. He spoke about his grandfather's sister. He said she had been killed and her body had been dumped in the water. He referred to this event with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested he was simply stating something he knew to be true. When Gus's parents investigated, they discovered something that made them deeply uncomfortable. Gus's grandfather had indeed had a sister. She had been murdered decades earlier. Her body had been dumped in San Francisco Bay. This was family history that had been actively concealed. Gus's parents had not known these details. The murder had occurred so long ago that it had been deliberately buried, considered too painful and shameful to discuss. There was absolutely no normal pathway through which an 18-month-old child could have learned this information. Gus also recognized photographs. When shown old family photos, he identified his grandfather with confidence, saying things like, "That's me," when looking at pictures from decades earlier. He correctly identified family members in group photographs, pointing to faces and providing names that matched. As the case of Gus Taylor has been documented by researchers at the University of Virginia, it represents a particularly striking example because the information the child possessed was not just obscure, but actively suppressed. The murder of his grandfather's sister was not dinner-table conversation. It was a painful secret that the family had deliberately kept hidden. How does an 18-month-old child access hidden family history? How does he know about a murder that occurred before his own father was born? How does he speak with casual certainty about events he could not possibly have witnessed? These are questions that continue to challenge researchers who study cases like his, and they suggest that whatever mechanism allows children to access past life memories, it operates independently of normal information channels. That are absolutely insane. But the next case throws even more questions into the mix. Number 3. The girl who was Anne Frank. This case is extremely controversial because it involves one of the most famous victims of the Holocaust. A Swedish woman has claimed for decades that she possesses memories of being Anne Frank in a previous life. And while skepticism is certainly warranted, some of the details she has provided are remarkably difficult to dismiss. Barbro Karlen was born in Stockholm, Sweden in 1954. From her earliest years, she displayed behaviors that confused her parents. She was terrified of men in uniforms. She refused to take showers, becoming hysterical when water came from overhead. She had recurring nightmares about hiding, about discovery, about being taken away. At age 3, Barbro told her parents that her name was not Barbro. Her name was Anne. Her parents were Lutheran Swedes with no connection to Jewish culture or history. The Second World War had ended only a decade before Barbro's birth, but Sweden had remained neutral, and the Frank family's story was not yet widely known. The diary had been published, but it had not yet achieved the global fame it would later attain. Barbro insisted she had lived before. She described hiding in a small space. She described being afraid constantly. She described writing in a diary because she believed her words would matter someday. When Barbro was 10 years old, her family traveled to Amsterdam. She had never been there before. Yet when they arrived, She began navigating the streets with confidence, and leading her confused parents through unfamiliar neighborhoods until they arrived at a building Barbara announced was her home. It was the Anne Frank house. Her parents were stunned. They had not planned to visit this location. They had not mentioned it to Barbara. They had not even known it existed. Yet their daughter had led them directly there, through streets she had never walked. Inside, Barbara became emotional. She pointed to the wall where Anne Frank had pasted pictures of movie stars. She commented that the pictures had been removed, and indeed, photographs document that pictures had once been displayed there. In adulthood, Barbara met Otto Frank, Anne's father, and the only member of the Frank family to survive the concentration camps. According to Barbara, Otto Frank listened to her claims with openness and compassion, and he neither confirmed nor denied the possibility that his daughter had returned in some form. He simply treated her with kindness. Barbara Carlen has written multiple books about her experiences and has maintained her claims throughout her life. She has been interviewed by researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. Her account has remained consistent across decades. Critics argue that Barbara may have absorbed information about Anne Frank through cultural exposure, even if she doesn't consciously remember the sources. This is a valid concern. Anne Frank's story became globally famous, and even indirect exposure could theoretically have seeded false memories. However, the navigation through Amsterdam at age 10, leading her parents directly to a building she had supposedly never seen, is more difficult to explain through this mechanism. The emotional responses, the specific phobias about showers and uniforms, and the consistency of her account across more than 60 years add layers of complexity. Whether Barbara Carlen was truly Anne Frank in a previous life is a question that can never be definitively answered. But her case raises profound questions about the nature of identity, memory, and what survives after physical death. And we're not done yet. The next case is one of the most detailed ever recorded. Number 2. The boy who was his own grandfather too. This case involves a child who identified himself as his deceased grandfather and provided verification details that his family found impossible to explain. And it represents one of the clearest examples of a child possessing specific knowledge about a deceased family member. Sam Taylor was born in Vermont approximately 18 months after his grandfather died. From the time he could speak, he made statements suggesting he remembered a previous life as that grandfather. The first indication came during a diaper change, an oddly consistent context in several of these cases. Sam looked at his father and said he used to change his father's diaper. When asked what he meant, Sam explained that he had been his grandfather, that he had come back. Sam's father was skeptical, but curious. He began testing his son's claims by asking questions that only someone with knowledge of the deceased grandfather could answer. Sam recognized his grandfather in photographs. When shown a picture containing multiple family members, he correctly identified which figure was his previous self. When shown his grandfather's portrait from age 30, he identified it correctly despite the significant difference in appearance from the elderly man the family remembered. But the most striking verification came when Sam was asked about his grandmother. Without prompting, Sam used a nickname for his grandmother that his grandfather had used exclusively. It was a pet name that had been private between husband and wife. No one in the family had ever discussed it with Sam. Sam also demonstrated knowledge about his grandfather's death. His grandfather had died of a slow illness. Sam provided accurate details about the final days, the medical equipment, and the circumstances of passing. And this information had not been discussed in the child's presence. When Sam's grandmother heard her late husband's private nickname for her coming from her young grandson's mouth, she was deeply shaken. It was a term of endearment that had belonged to their marriage alone. There was no possible way a toddler could have learned it through normal means. Dr. Jim Tucker investigated Sam's case as part of his research at the University of Virginia. He documented the verifications, interviewed family members, and assessed the child's claims using standardized methods developed over decades of research. What makes cases within families particularly interesting is that they eliminate certain skeptical explanations. The child could not have been influenced by reading about an obscure historical figure, because the figure in question was his own grandfather. The information existed only within family memory, and much of it had never been shared with the youngest generation. Sam Taylor's memories faded as he grew older, following the typical pattern. Today, he has no recollection of claiming to be his grandfather, but the family's memories of those years remain vivid, and the documented verifications continue to challenge researchers seeking conventional explanations. Are you ready for the final case? Then listen carefully, because this one encompasses decades of scientific research. Number 1. The scientific investigation. This final entry is not about a single child, but about a phenomenon that has been systematically studied for over 50 years by researchers at one of America's most prestigious medical schools. Yet it represents the culmination of thousands of investigated cases and points toward patterns that demand explanation. Dr. Ian Stevenson began researching children who claimed to remember previous lives in 1960. A psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, he approached the subject with scientific rigor, developing methodologies for investigating claims, verifying details, and eliminating alternative explanations. Over the course of his career, Stevenson investigated more than 2,500 cases from cultures around the world. He published his findings in peer-reviewed academic journals. He subjected his work to scrutiny from colleagues who were often skeptical, and the patterns he documented have proven remarkably consistent. The typical case begins when a child between the ages of 2 and 5 begins speaking about a previous life, and the child often describes how they died in that life, frequently mentioning violent or unexpected death. They provide names, locations, and specific details. They express a strong desire to return to their previous family. In approximately 70% of cases Stevenson investigated, the previous personality had died by unnatural causes, including accidents, violence, or sudden illness. This is far higher than the rate of unnatural death in the general population, suggesting that the manner of death may influence whether memories carry forward. In cases where verification was possible, Stevenson documented numerous instances of children providing accurate details about deceased individuals they had never met and places they had never visited. Birthmarks and birth defects sometimes corresponded to wounds suffered by the previous personality, a finding that challenges purely psychological explanations. Dr. Jim Tucker has continued Stevenson's research after his death in 2007. Tucker's work has focused particularly on American cases, which eliminate cultural factors as explanations. He has documented cases where children provided names, addresses, and obscure details that were later verified through historical records. The University of Virginia research suggests that these memories are not random. They tend to involve lives that ended traumatically or prematurely. They tend to occur in children at specific developmental stages. They tend to fade as the child approaches school age. And they tend to include verifiable details that the child could not have learned through normal means. What causes these memories remains unknown. Stevenson and Tucker have not claimed to prove reincarnation in a religious sense. They have simply documented a phenomenon that existing scientific models cannot adequately explain. Some theories suggest that consciousness may not be produced by the brain, but rather filtered through it, with information potentially persisting across what we perceive as separate lives. Others propose quantum explanations involving non-local consciousness. Still others suggest that we simply do not yet understand enough about the nature of memory and identity to explain what these children demonstrate. What is certain is that thousands of children across cultures, religions, and continents have displayed knowledge that defies conventional explanation. They have recognized strangers as previous family members. They have navigated unfamiliar locations with inexplicable accuracy. They have provided names, dates, and circumstances that researchers have verified again and again. Whether these cases point toward reincarnation, suggest undiscovered aspects of consciousness, or indicate something else entirely, they represent a phenomenon that deserves serious attention. The children making these claims are not seeking publicity or financial gain. They are simply reporting experiences that feel utterly real to them. And that is perhaps the most compelling aspect of all these cases. The children are not claiming to believe in reincarnation. They are claiming to remember. So what do you think? Is there really more behind these stories than we can imagine? Which case fascinated you personally the most? Let us know in the comments below. We're really excited to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. Thank you so much.